Hello, and welcome to your Daily Strength Coach podcast, episode 50. Holy fuck, what a question. Hello, how's it going? Welcome to episode 50 of your daily online strength coach podcast. Really gotta come up with a shortened version or a better version of that name. So episode 50, made it this far. It's probably taken about 5 weeks longer than it should have been with the gaps in recording, but such is life. I will persevere with it. Hopefully get back to more regular recordings soon. As soon as I get settled into some kind of routine, which doesn't really appear to be that possible working in sport. Well. So today's question, two questions I will answer, both under the episode 48 video. The first one from Michael, which I will answer in the next episode, about deadlift lockout. There was one question in particular that just from the sheer amount of intricacy and the detail that was going to require to answer it, I couldn't really let it go. I thought it would be a good one for the 50th podcast. Hopefully I won't keep it going too long. I'll try to keep it as actionable and as sparing with needless detail as possible. So it's from Weightlifting, Heart the PB Machine watermark. I also really like that logo. Might hijack it for Online Strength Coach, or hijack it for a rebrand Online Strength Coach or something else. I have a question. Often guidelines are given for how much volume to do at a given percentage. Prilepin touted so much. But do you have or know any guidelines for weekly volume across lifts? For example, there are well documented and available training volumes for different classes of weightlifter, and how it should be split across the lifts, and how that should modulate from general to competition training periods. But I haven't seen any of that for powerlifting. This relates to what you were saying about blunting training response and how you think deadlift is different to train, i.e. 50 reps in 70 to 80% across the week for squat and bench, but only 10 to 20 for deadlift, or even more for bench. Also, how you set up training volumes differently for beginner, intermediate, and more advanced lifters, and why. We'd love to hear what you have to say on it. Podcasts are banging. Keep them going. Fully intend to. Thank you very much for your question. So first of all, Prilepin's chart it almost solely relates to the actual competition lifts and variants, so snatch, clean and jerk, which are inherently different from squats and deadlifts because they have a ballistic component and they have a much higher skill component. So the amount of work done at 90% plus for those lifts, I don't believe applies at all to deadlifting, squatting and bench pressing. Prilepin, if you have any kind of idea of the history behind that chart, he was the national weightlifting coach for Russia. He spent 5 years as the junior coach, 5 years as the senior coach during the period of 1975 to 1985. I could have got those dates wrong, but 70s to 80s. You can search his name if you want to get more of the detail. But basically, he was the most successful Russian weightlifting coach of all time. The chart that, if you search for it, you will find online was taken from information from thousands of hours of weightlifting training, and it's just collated data. But it pertains almost solely to the competition lifts. Now, if you look at the competition lift and the weightlifting versus powerlifting, in a snatch or a clean, due to the ballistic nature of the movement, there is a window of opportunity from which the lifter must move themselves down to a sufficient height to catch the bar. Failure to reverse yourself down into sufficient height or sufficient depth to catch a clean or a snatch results in a failed lift. This, of course, is not the case in deadlift and squat, where the lifter is pretty much in control of the bar at all times when successfully lifting. When the lifter fails to control the bar, they're either in for a torrid time when they come up with it, or they will miss the lift because they'll come through a weak position and thus fail the lift because they're coming through a weak position. If you do look at some research, or certainly using the same sort of research from Soviet scientists, you'll see for back squat, they actually reckon that higher volumes with moderate weights was a better way to train the squat. So that's where the idea of the Russian squat routine comes from. If you have a look at Sportniov Press, there is an article where someone's pretty much just taken that training cycle of the 9 sessions of accumulation and the 9 sessions of realization and turned it into the Russian squat routine. And someone's elongated that and turned it into the Russian squat masters program. So that's where those two programs originate from. If you look at squat and bench press, what you have is concentric, eccentric action, from which the lifter is in control of the bar at all times. So that they can be trained very similarly. If you look at the deadlift, what you have is concentric only action. Concentric only action, where unless you do a touch and go or you do an RDL, you don't control the eccentric component. Typically you set the bar down or drop it, and then come from a concentric only motion again. These are inherently different situations, and as such, you'll see. I don't really know if anyone actually knows how to train deadlift. I'm sure there are some people, but you'll see some people who will deadlift once every fortnight. Some people deadlift once every 10 days. Some people deadlift higher frequencies 2 to 3 times a week. Look within Norwegian powerlifting, those programs, or Danish, Danish, I think. Danish. Dennis Wolf's programs, or that Norwegian powerlifting, you'll see a higher frequency, 2 to 3 times a week. They'll use some variation. You'll see other people who will train the deadlift in parts, where they'll do still concentric only, but they'll do a partial range, so say from 18 inches from the floor, from a deficit, 3 times a week. Tom Martin, famous for advocating that kind of training. Mark Clegg as well. Both very good deadlifters who have historically trained with that kind of method. So there are many ways of training deadlift, all of which seem to work. But I don't know if anyone has categorically a deadlift system that works for like a sustained period and will give you kind of a, not really predictable, because quite a lot of programs aren't very predictable. I mean, for instance, Russian squat routine is suggested to give you a 5% gain, but you can go anywhere from 10 to 12 to 15% off that program, or less, depending on where you are and, like, training history going into the program. Someone with a typical low volume or a low frequency approach go into that program. So, for example, if they go from a 1 day a week kind of typical program to 2 day a week Russian squat routine, they'll get huge gains out of that. Probably get 10 to 15% gain off that if it's their first run. Whereas someone who is coming from Smolov onto that might not realize the same sort of gain, if that makes sense. So someone who's going from a higher volume to that kind of Russian squat routine to a lower volume might not realize the same kind of progress. They may still realize progress. It's a very open-ended problem programming. It's not very easy to put into boxes. Therefore, it's not very sexy, and therefore, it's probably not very well read by most people who listen to this kind of podcast or read on programming. Probably haven't read a lot about programming, or they may have read a lot about programming. What you'll have read will probably not go past 4 weeks of planning. You'll see repetitive cycling or loading patterns that can be used cyclically that don't necessarily give you an appreciation of how to put together a year of training, 2 years of training, how to weave blocks together. Or you'll have what's called concurrent training or concurrent periodization, which is another complete nonsense. Or another nonsense, daily undulating periodization. Like we discussed in previous podcasts, they show a lack of appreciation for where certain things fit in your annual cycle. So for example, a dumbbell bench press for someone who bench presses over 200 kilos is highly unlikely to be anything other than assistance work and hypertrophy assistance at that, because they're probably not be able to get heavy enough bells, or probably not practical enough for them to train with bells to be a sufficient strength stimulus to where they can accrue volume and get better at it. It can be used, and in another instance, for someone who's a complete novice, something like a dumbbell bench press can be used as a direct way of gaining strength within bench press, or it can be used to teach better limb control, better timing from the bottom. So when someone goes from a barbell, which is fixed and not easy for a beginner to control, fairly easy to control, and they go on to dumbbells, they get better muscular control, they build up strength within rotator cuffs and stabilizing muscles, and they go back to barbell. It's not uncommon for that person to find they've realized a fairly large strength gain with that kind of programming. So within those two different lifters, program and exercise can fulfill much different roles. So it's all context specific. So you're not going to get a nice easy answer on this, which you'll never get from me, to be honest. I'm not really a easy answer kind of person. I like to just give you things as they are, or at least as I perceive them to be, in their due complexity, in their due reality, and you can deal with that as is. If you want to truly understand it, then I highly suggest that you start training people, and you do so for a long period of time. When you get to the end of that period, then you will have a much better understanding of programs. So if we actually go to the actual question, as regards volumes per lift as total. So the best way to look at volumes, first of all, most people don't really look at the volumes of lifting. The best way to look at the volume of lifting is just total lifts for that lift per week. So for someone like me, if I tout up my current program during the accumulation phases at lighter intensities, I am currently doing 54 lifts for squat and for bench press, and I am doing 45 lifts for deadlift with a frequency of 3. I will do that week 1 an intensity 65%, week 2 at an intensity of 75%, and then from 75% to 80% I will start to bring in, split the volume. So for example, on week 1 of that accumulation, I will do 3 sets of 6 at 65%. I won't deviate from that load. In week 3, I may do 2 sets of 6 at 75%, and then possibly maybe go for a triple at 80%, and maybe a single 85%. And then on week 4, I may do something similar, splitting up volumes and reaching higher intensities with an average intensity of roughly 75% in week 3 and roughly 80% in week 4. So that's how you should look at your programming. Don't look at it as a workout. Look at it as within the context of a 4-week block. So you're doing a 4-week block. Look at the average intensity for the week, and look at the total number of lifts for the week, and then split that up as you see fit within your week. Frequency, again, dependent. Some lifters who like to lift with greater intensity in a single workout will use a frequency of 1. Lifters who like to lift with a high intensity in 1 and have a back off in intensity in another session will have a frequency of 2. Lifters who like to train at fairly low intensity and just like to put work in will lift with higher. We'll usually find higher frequencies, sort them anything from 3 to 6, depending on the person. And then when you look at how different lifters respond to volumes, again, it's completely individual. Some lifters will respond to a volume of 25 if it's sufficient intensity and get great gains off that. Some lifters can do single sets and get strong off that for sustained periods with volumes of 10, 8 to 10, 6 to 10 lifts in a week with sufficient intensity might be enough for some lifters to get stronger on. Other lifters might do 150 to 200 lifts in a week of various intensities. It really is individual. What you'll have with someone with their own concoction. So, for example, myself within my own genetic hormonal and training history cocktail that makes me as a lifter. I respond differently from yourself if you're listening to this. So you have your own genetics, your own hormonal profile, your own neurological adaptations that you've accrued over time as a person or as a lifter. You, at this moment in time, will respond differently to training. Some people who are cardiovascularly fit may find that they can sustain much larger volumes than people who are uncardiovascularly fit. So, for example, some of the lifters I've worked with in the past, who are some of the strongest lifters I've worked with in the past, will not go past a frequency of 1. For most lifts, certainly for squat and deadlift, they will not go past a frequency of 1. And they will typically work between 20 to 30 reps total in a session. For deadlift, perhaps less than that. It's where it comes within the training process. It comes from understanding where that person is currently, and how you're going to adapt from where they are currently, and take them on their journey, as it were, or take that programming process through logical strides. So, for example, if I was to work with someone who typically had a large history of rep-out training, training to failure, trying to push the envelope all the time, the first thing I would do with that person is just reduce their training stress dramatically. I'd probably reduce their training stress. If training stress was a measurable factor, which I know Mike Tushner is trying to do, I've come across that recently, fatigue factors and things like that. Let's say you train with a 1 to 10 fatigue factor. Let's say you train with a fatigue factor of 10, where you feel your workouts from up to 10 days. So you do so let's say you train deadlift with a fatigue factor of 10. This is completely arbitrary, completely made up, but it's just to put across a point. If you train deadlift with a fatigue factor of 10, and you can only deadlift once every fortnight or once every 10 days, because you deadlift through bad positions, you put your body through stresses, and it takes that long to recover from that, then you can't expose yourself to frequency, you can't expose yourself to volume, which means more than likely your skill component of the lift is very poor, your intramuscular coordination is very poor, your rate coding factors are very poor. Maybe you have good force production in that, or you've acquired reasonably good force production within that very specific position that you deadlift from. Although it may not be the optimal position for your body shape or your levers, it's just where you've trained from, and you've developed good force characteristics from that position with a barbell by training with high intensity once every 10 or 14 days. Now, if I was to deal with that lifter, first thing I would do would take that fatigue factor of 10 and reduce it by 3, and I would start training with a frequency of 2 to 3 times. Start with a low volume, probably start with a volume of 20 to 30, and run through 3 to 4 cycles of training like that, gradually ramping up volumes and gradually ramping up intensities from block to block, and possibly retest at the end of that. See how they've, all likelihood being, if they jive with the training, at the other side of that block, they'll probably realize quite a decent gain in strength, as long as they're not relying on anabolics to produce strength gains, or they're not of a very advanced level of strength. It is highly likely that person will realize a strength gain. Now, we've shown this person we're working with, that strength gain doesn't have to be achieved with intensity alone. Strength gain can be achieved with frequency and volume and attention to detail. And then we're talking a different ball game with that person. We're taking them down on a, and then what we start tweaking with variables. We do maybe we do an intensification block, see they react to that. Maybe we do a rep out block, see they react to that. Maybe we do high volume block, see they react to that. We basically, within a general preparation phase, or within a phase of training where it's not important for that person to come away with a great strength gain or to reach a certain level or a certain standard, we can see how they respond to different volumes, different intensities, and different methods of training. For example, some people I may work with may use a lot of variation within their training, depending on where they are. Most will not use variation. Most will just stick to whatever they're trying to get good at. And they will work at that to get better at that discrete skill that they're trying to get better at. So there is no yes or no answer. In general strokes, eccentric, concentric lifts respond much better to a mix of volume and frequency, then they do intensity. Deadlift responds to everything, but it doesn't respond systematically to everything. So within my own deadlift, I'm trying to treat it more like the other lifts and see how I get it on. I've been doing that for about 5 to 6 weeks, and so far it has responded very well to that kind of training. So I will continue to work along those lines. If you check out Boris Shuko's stuff, you will see within his programs the different total number of lifts, the different average intensities. You can definitely read into that quite a lot as how he organizes his training. It's a very good way of looking at his training. You can start reading up on some of Dennis Wolf's stuff, although there's not a lot of it online. I know there is a manual kicking around somewhere, a Norwegian manual, which is definitely worth looking at if you can get your hands on it. I currently haven't. But like there is a massive amount of individuality within the programming process. But typically, I would say for the power lifts, intensity isn't the overriding factor. Volume is the overriding factor, and accruing volumes at appropriate percentages at appropriate times, and modulating for fatigue as best as possible is how you kind of weave together a good program. And then within that, of course, there are different sort of exercises you can use, and there are different kind of methods you can use. I've used a mixture of pause squat and high box squat with some lifters, and got phenomenal results over the back of 4 or 5 weeks of doing that. For various reasons, positional reasons, you can use chains and bands. Bands are a good positional tool. It's not quite as simple as there is this as a beginner should lift this volume at these intensities, an intermediate should lift these volumes at these intensities, and an advanced lifter should lift these volumes at these intensities, because we don't have sufficient data to make those generalizations. So without having sufficient data to make those generalizations, it is senseless to have this conversation. What we need to look at is just everyone as a case by case basis. Primarily, how do they move? If they move well, how do they train? If they train well, what's the training history, and how can we positively influence this person with good technique and this person who has a good training history? If they move incorrectly, then we must fix that movement. If they train incorrectly or they train poorly, then we must train them. But they move well, we must change their training environment or their training philosophy. If they do both well, then we need to look at how we can either us adapt, can we learn from them? Can I learn from this lifter? Are they doing something that I haven't thought of? Are they doing something better than me? If yes, how can I adapt it? How can I take it into my philosophy? Or if not, how can I best influence this person positively within this dynamic as a coach, or within this dynamic as writing a program? Okay. I'll appreciate I haven't really given a nice clean-cut answer that you may have liked. Fortunately, that does not exist. I'm going to leave it there because I think that's a fairly good natural end point. Thank you very much for supporting the podcast and listening. I will be launching these online now. I did say that I would go onto iTunes from Podcast 50, and this is Podcast 50. So the next stage is to launch this on iTunes. I will adjunct it onto the Online Strength Coach website as our podcast. And going forward, I will be starting to release Online Strength Coach and going through that process. So thanks very much for listening. Thank you very much for supporting the podcast. Any questions, please leave them below. Any shout-outs, leave them below. We'll try to reach out on air. Questions, comments, inquiries for training, give me a cash money dollar. speedpowerperformance@gmail.com. Check out my own blog, castironstrength.com. And please come and check out Online Strength Coach when we finally do float it. This has been Mark. It is the 21st of October 2015. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll leave you to the sounds of MOP Hustle. Until next time, thank you very much. Try to limit you to fade back to me, so